I know you ask yourself this question because I used to ask myself this question. Tell me if this sounds familiar. You've got your pattern, you've cut it all out, you put it down, you're following the layout instructions as on your pattern instruction sheet, and then you're thinking, that seems like a big waste. Or maybe you don't have quite enough fabric and you're trying to make your pattern pieces fit onto the fabric you've got, and the inevitable question comes up is, can I move my pattern pieces around, maybe turn it upside down or just shift the angle to make it fit? Well, let's talk about that. I have some rules to follow when you want to go off pattern, and then 5 tips on how you can actually save fabric while cutting out your sewing patterns. Welcome back, my friends. My name is Evelyn Wood, and here on this channel we do everything vintage sewing skills to help our modern day sewing. So you can learn to create things, not just copy, but create. Know the rules so you know how to make better decisions for what you want to make yourself. One of those rules is going off pattern. This is how I describe it to all my students at Vintage Sewing School, and it's to go off pattern. How do you not follow the pattern instructions, right? It's something that we all aim to do, I think. I know I did when I first started, was particularly the cutting instructions, because I know, we buy random bits of fabric here and there and then want to make a pattern work for it. So we never have the exact amount of fabric that they list on the back of the envelope. And what are the ways that we can make it work? Either just to save and be conservative in fabric, which you should always do, or a few tips on sort of how to actually maybe make it fit when it doesn't quite fit. So I have I have 2 rules, the rules of this cutting out your fabric and patterns to follow, that basically answer the question of, can I move the pattern pieces around? And then I also have 5 tips on how you can save fabric and just kind of make things work, and what you can fudge to make it work sometimes. So just what are the 2 rules you need to follow when laying out your pattern pieces? Basically, this is just like a big jigsaw puzzle, and we're just making them all fit. But there are some rules, guidelines that need to be followed. And one of them is the grain line. This is the most important one. So you must follow your grain line. It's there for a reason. We've all made something and neglected to follow the grain line and found out the really hard way. So it'll be marked on every single pattern you ever buy, I promise you. And it must be parallel with your selvages. So you want this grain line to run lengthwise down your fabric, parallel to your selvages, so it stays on the straight grain. Every pattern piece will have this. That way, when you cut out your pattern pieces, they're all going to fall in the same way. You won't have one that's this way, one that's that way, and then one drapes differently than the other. One will be on straight grain, one will be on bias, trying to do a seam down the middle. It will not work. You will not get a uniform garment. So grain line is the number 1 rule. The other rule is the what I call top to bottom, top to bottom. So some patterns will suggest that you, in fact, have your patterns top to tail like this to fit in. And well, you can, but my personal rule is that I always keep them in the same direction, top to tail. Why? Well, if you have obviously with obvious prints, one-way stripes, a nap, any sort of piles, so think velvet fabric or things like this, they have an obvious, when you brush it one way, it goes one direction, you brush it the other way, and it all like lifts up. That's a pile. It's similar to a nape. Let's not go into those details too much in this video, but you want it to be uniform. Now, there are small differences, even if you don't notice it really at first, how the light hits the fabric and how it bounces back at you. It's very, very small. And for me, it's these small little things that if you have one this way and then one is the other way, right? It might only be very, very small, but it's things like this that the shine will just come off in a slightly different way if you have one this way and one this way. So it is my personal preference that I keep everything top to tail, and that's how I stay out of trouble in that realm. And then basically following this rule is just how you using those two guidelines is how you puzzle piece these two, well, all of your pattern pieces to actually fit onto the fabric you have. You can turn them this way, this way, this way, this way, and I have a few suggestions for you coming up, but that's how it works and how you can start to go off pattern. As long as you follow those two things, you're pretty good to go and can cut them out in whatever way, so long as you follow the grain line and go top to tail, top to tail, top to bottom, top to bottom. Following these two rules actually does answer the question of, can you just move the pattern pieces around to fit? So, you know, what we're tempted to do as beginners is this little gap here. You think, but if I put my pattern this way, it'll just fit so much better and save so much fabric. We've all made this mistake. As I was saying before, this grain line through every pattern piece needs to remain uniform over each pattern. That way it goes around the whole body and you have that straight grain line. That's so you're like 0.00, your starting point for all of your fabric cutting, patterns, etc. Everything is come from your grain line and must remain the same all the way around. That is how you will get a beautiful finished garment all the way. Think if you have a stretch or something like this on your fabric, you don't want one piece to stretch this way and one to stretch across the body. That's not going to work. Keeping your grain line intact is how you keep it uniform, and I promise you, by just following this will save you a lot of troubles and hassles later on in trying to sew and then your end garment. So just what are some of the tips I have for you on how you can kind of cheat a little bit and save some fabric in the cutting out? Okay, first one is you can in fact flip your pattern pieces over and to the other side. So rather than like changing the direction, you can think about flipping it upside down. Because if you're cutting 2 layers, as we usually do on a fold, so we have a pair. So when you fold it out, you actually get a pair of pattern pieces, not just 2 of the same, but a matching pair. Doesn't really matter. So as long as you keep them all the same, obviously you'll have to figure out how to get your markings to the other side and all of that. That is not for this video, but you can do it this way if you need to. If that's a way that your pattern pieces can make and fit better, definitely flip it over. Just draw in your grain line, hold it up to the light. You can usually see through your pattern pieces. Draw in your grain line so you've got that golden rule to follow. And so you can make sure that you still get your pattern piece on grain, but managing them this way. The next tip is you can actually use the selvages into your seam allowances. This one I wouldn't recommend to use all the time, and I would only use with caution. But if you look inside many, many vintage dresses, I know I've found they actually have the selvage as part of the seam allowance. Obviously, this is only for a straight grain section, but it is a thing. And sometimes just being able to put that tiny little bit into the corner where your seam allowance is can absolutely save your entire piece and make it work in that fabric. So for example, this one here, if I needed to, maintaining your grain line, of course, if I needed, say, this little edge to come into the selvage, I could do that. Just make sure that your selvage isn't one that sometimes they can be pulled in and a bit tight. That's obviously not going to work. But if it's nice and flat like this, you could absolutely, as long as you make sure that selvage doesn't come out into your garment and you don't get any of those little holes from the tender hooks in there, you can do this. Think outside the box a little bit. You could use your facings and your pocket, like say inseam pocket pieces or patch pockets in a different fabric. So they are pieces that go on the inside of the garment. You could just use maybe even a contrast in a fun contrast print and have your facings in a different color, or maybe just something similar. But these kind of internal pieces like this, pockets, facings, even waistbands, you could do in a contrast or a different fabric so that you can still use your main fabric that you have in mind for the actual main garment. And along these lines is you could actually cut off your hem allowance. Say if you have a really large hem allowance, you could actually cut this down. So for instance, I think this is 5 centimeter hem allowance on this one, but just say it doesn't quite fit. What I could do is trim this down so that I have just a seam allowance rather than a hem allowance. Leave just a little bit so that my pattern piece would then fit onto the garment and use a bias tape or something similar to actually use as your hem allowance. So then you could actually sew this onto the end garment and hem it with this tape rather than having the hem in the same fabric. I have done this several times over the years and that has saved me many times, and I get to use that fabric that I really like for that design just by thinking a little bit differently about your hem allowance. Now this is the sneakiest trick of them all. So you can actually refold your fabric in a different way. So this goes really off pattern and usually, at least anyway. So rather than just having one fold line, if you need 2 pattern pieces that are on a fold each, you need 2 lengths to actually get that in. But sometimes just a little bit of outside thinking. Now I'm just going to finger press this fold in to make this easier for demonstration, is that you can fold each side into the center, and now you have 2 folds of your fabric to work with. Now you must make sure that this is perfectly even. You must maintain your grain line as normal. So how you would do that is you would measure from your selvage to the fold here, selvage to the fold here, make sure that is the same amount all the way through, and of course the same on the other side. Make sure it is perfectly even. But then, for example, if you did need 2 pieces on the fold, you can then fit 2 pattern pieces often on that same length, that one length of fabric, rather than needing 2 to fit your garments in. I know, that's probably one of the biggest little secrets, I think, in cutting patterns and fabrics that I have found over the years. It's helped me save me a lot of time. And mostly a lot of fabric. And it means you can squeeze in that oh so beautiful fabric that you really love onto with the pattern pieces that you've got working with. So remember, this is your garment. You are the designer here and you are the creator. So you can do whatever it is that you want. But now that you know the rules and have a bit more information as to why that the rules are in place, you can more, I hope at least, better choose what is right for you and your project in different ways, and think outside the box that you can save a bit of fabric for each project that you have, and maybe just squeeze in that gorgeous fabric that you've been dying to use for a certain pattern. A few of these tips might just help you maintain a beautiful garment on grain the entire way around, but you can just squeeze it in on that just too little fabric that you might have. Please do go check the description box below, because I have many other videos on grain lines, on right and wrong sides of fabric that I think that you'll really enjoy. So let me know below which is your favorite one of these that you're going to try for your next project. And of course, if you have any further tips for us, do let us know, because the more we share all of our sewing information with each other, the more we all learn and get better at our sewing. So leave those comments below. And until next time, my friends, happy sewing. Bye.